Hi, I'm Josephine Cameron. I'm the author of Maybe a Mermaid and A Dog Friendly Town, which is coming out this August 2020. I'm here today to talk to you about setting and how to use setting to shape your stories. Setting to me is very important. The place where my stories happen is often the very first thing that I think of when I'm coming up with a story idea. I feel like often when we're talking about setting, we think about it in terms of description. How can you use words to describe the setting, the place that your character is in to make the story come alive? And that's important. But I think about it differently than that. To me, the place that my story is set is far more fundamental. It shapes everything about the story. So I thought I would share with you how I come up with ideas using setting, and maybe you can try some of these tips yourself. When I start thinking about a story idea, I usually start thinking about where I want it to happen before I start thinking about anything else. It might seem a little bit backwards, but to me, place can help you find your characters. They can help you find what your story is really going to be about. For instance, in Maybe a Mermaid, this book is about an 11-year-old girl named Anthony Gillis, and she and her mom have been traveling around from town to town selling beauty products for her mom's company, Beauty and the Bee. And they end up for the summer at this place called the Showboat Resort. And Anthony's always had a hard time finding a friend because of how much they've been moving around. She decides that when they get to the Showboat Resort, she's going to put together a foolproof plan and find a true blue friend. But of course, nothing goes according to the plan, and they are staying on this lake, and strange things start happening in the lake that lead Anthony to believe maybe a mermaid is living in the lake. Um, and when I first started the story, all I really knew was I wanted it to take place on a lake in northern Wisconsin. I grew up on a lake in northern Wisconsin. And in fact, the place where I grew up, there were lakes everywhere. There was a lake on either side of my road. So I knew a lot about what it felt like to grow up on a lake. And I didn't have quite all the pieces of the story together, though. I just sort of knew I wanted it to happen there and that Anthony and her mom would come there. But I didn't really click into place the true story until I met the character of Charlotte Boulet. And I say meet the character of Charlotte Boulet because um, I found her when I was thinking about setting. So I thought about northern Wisconsin and tried to think of some of the places up north that had been really interesting or intriguing to me when I was a kid. What places that made me really curious. And one of those places that came to mind was this old resort called the Northern Air Resort. And on this resort, there was a building that was shaped like a boat, and it was called the Showboat Lounge. And in the showboat used to be super famous back when my grandparents were little, but then by the time I was a kid, it was really run down. Nobody ever went there. We went there sometimes for taco night. You could go to the Showboat Lounge, this big boat-shaped building, and you could have taco night. But mostly it was really deserted and no one stayed there anymore. And I started thinking about that place because it always caught my imagination. And I started thinking, who would still be there if Anthony and her mom showed up at a place like this? Who would still be there? And I remembered that when my grandparents were young, that resort was very famous, and a lot of resorts like it were very famous for having vaudeville actors who would come and perform. Vaudeville was sort of this old-timey variety show that was really popular before movies. And the vaudeville actors would come to these resorts in the summer and they would put on plays and dances and sing and do magic and all kinds of interesting trick animals and contortionists and acrobatics and all kinds of stuff. And so the place made me think, wait, I could set this on a resort, and a person who might live at this resort could be an ex-vaudeville actor, someone who used to be part of this whole big variety show. Um, and that's when I met Charlotte Boulay. That's when she popped into my head. And if you read the book, you know that she's a very important part of the book. And I would never have thought of her if I hadn't thought of that specific place. Setting can also help you find your plot. It can help you figure out what's going to happen in the book that could not happen anywhere else. If it was set somewhere different, it would be a different story. And so my husband grew up in Los Angeles, and we were visiting his aunt and uncle in a town a little bit further north called Carmel, California. And we were driving around this cute little town, and my Aunt Joey said, Carmel is a very dog friendly town. In fact, they just won an award called Dogtown USA because they are so dog friendly. They have little water bowls in front of the stores for all the dogs. There are a lot of stores that were created for dogs. And I immediately got out my notebook and I was so excited. I wrote down dog friendly town. I knew immediately that I wanted to set a story in a dog friendly town. I had no idea what would happen there. I just knew it would be fun. And so as we sort of explored this town, we went to all kinds of interesting places that I locked into my brain. We went to this very posh, dog friendly hotel called the Cypress Inn that was run, co owned by Doris Day, who was one of my favorite old timey singers and actresses back in the 1950s when my grandparents were young. I love her movies and her songs. And this hotel had meals for dogs. Dogs could sit at the table and have breakfast with you. We went and had dinner there, and there were dogs sitting at the tables and having little treats. And um, we went to a store that had, you could make an appointment to try on dog collars for your dogs, and the professional in the store would help you figure out which collar was right for your dog. And as we were sort of going through all of these places, I started to think about what kind of a fun story could happen in a place like this that would be different than something that would happen anywhere else. And so I started to imagine there might be, if a town like this won an award like Dogtown USA, um, there might be a big celebration and celebrities would probably come, like Doris Day, right, who owned this hotel. And then I was thinking about that place where we went and saw people trying on dog collars, helping their dogs try on dog collars. And I started to think, well, what if these kids, Epic and his siblings, lived at a dog friendly bed and breakfast in a town like Carmel, which I actually called their town Carmelito, which means Little Carmel, just as a nod to the place where I got the idea. And I started to think, okay, well, what if a bunch of celebrities came to celebrate the award that the town is getting? And what if one of these very fancy dog collars went missing? We could have a mystery. And so that's what happens in a dog friendly town. I would never have come up with any of those ideas if I hadn't thought of the place first and what was unique about the place and what was interesting about the place I wanted to set my story in. So, one of the things that I think is really important when thinking about setting and place is that it's not just about description. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like, right? All of these senses. It's also about emotion. It's about relationships. Every single character in your story is going to have a different relationship with their setting. So, a good example is in Maybe a Mermaid. Um, the most of the action happens on Thunder Lake. And every character in my story has a different relationship to Thunder Lake. Anthony, my main character, is terrified to put her head under the water of Thunder Lake. She does not know what is in that lake. It does not make her feel good to go in it. Her mother, on the other hand, has all these wonderful memories about Thunder Lake and she went there as a kid and she loves it. And when she jumps into that lake, she feels free. She feels young again. Um, the boy next door, DJ, he broke his arm at the beginning of the summer and he can't really go in the lake and enjoy it the way he likes to. He thinks about the lake as just like fun and exciting, but now it's forbidden and he can't go into it. So he's got this sort of longing for the lake. Charlotte Boulet, the owner of the Showboat Resort, she grew up on the lake as well, and she lost her mother. Um, she has a very complicated relationship with the lake. So you see, it's not just about what does the lake look like? How does it feel when you jump into it? What does the water sound like when it's splashing around? It's also very specific to each of your characters. How does your character feel about the environment they are around, right? And it could be any kind of environment. Doesn't matter. It can be as small as a closet, right? Think about Harry Potter. He lived in that closet. His relationship with that closet, right, is what really sets up the entire story. It's how we meet him. It's how we learn about him, is the place that he has been living in all of these years. So when you are thinking about setting and thinking about place, think about how does that place and how does that setting affect your character and all the other characters in your book? When you're designing your setting, your place that your story is taking place, it really helps to make it as real in your mind as you possibly can. If it's a real place, like the Showboat Resort, that makes it easy because you can kind of maybe remember some things about this real place. Even still, though, it's helpful, I think, to take a little bit of time and draw it out. So, when I was working in a dog friendly town, I drew a map of the town. I'm not an artist, but I did it anyway to get a sense of where the streets were, where's the school in relation to the hotel that they live at, where's the park where all of the festivities are taking place, where's the beach, how, when they're running from place to place, it really changed. I actually had to change some of the story after I drew the map because I realized, oh, they couldn't actually go to the beach first before this happens, or they couldn't get to the park this way and pass this particular store and talk to this particular person. They'd have to do it a different way. I also drew a map of the inside of the bed and breakfast, and that changed a lot of things too. I'm not going to spoil any part of the mystery, but it did change some of the clues I was able to um, put into the book, depending on whose room was next to whose, and all kinds of things like that. So it's really, really helpful not to just imagine it, but maybe to draw it out and think about, okay, what does this place really look like? And does that change any of the things, any of the ideas that I've had of what's going to happen in my story? If you're like me, it probably changes it. So I'd like to challenge you to try this out. Test it out. See what happens if instead of starting looking for a story idea by starting with character or plot or the things that we typically think of when we think of story ideas, see what happens if you try to come up with a story idea based on setting first, on the place where the story is going to happen. I would suggest make a list of interesting places that you've been, and not just um, interesting places, but places that have really caught your curiosity, or places where you've felt some strong emotion. I used to be terrified to put my head under the lake. So the lake was a place where I remember feeling very scared. And um, think of a place you've been where you felt especially happy or excited or sad. Um, and then take that place, pick one. Make the whole list, but pick one place and set a story there. Think about in this particular place, who would be there and why. Think about what could happen there that couldn't happen anywhere else. It would happen here because it's here. And then think about start to develop those characters. And when you've figured out who is in this place and why, think about what each of their relationships to the place is and how they are different from each other. Um, and draw a map. Draw two maps. Draw a map of the town. Draw a map of the house. Draw a map of the closet. Think about all the details of what is in that place and see if your story feels different than other ways that you've come up with stories. It's personally my favorite way to come up with ideas for stories. And then I feel like all that other stuff we talk about with setting, all the description, all of the tactile senses, it's already built in. And it shows up sort of naturally because place has become such an important part. It's the core, the fundamental part of how you've created that story. And have fun with it.